The ground was cold, not the kind of cold that makes you pull a jacket tighter, the kind that seeps through fabric, through skin, through muscle, until it reaches something deeper, something that has no name but every soldier knows it when they feel it against their back. The kind of cold that reminds you quietly and without apology that the earth does not care whether you live or die on it. Maya Cole knew that cold. She was lying on her left side on the floor of a crumbling building in Khost Province, Afghanistan, in the final weeks of November 2009. The wall behind her had 3 bullet holes in it. The ceiling above had partially collapsed sometime before they arrived, and through the gap, she could see a strip of sky black, starless and indifferent. Her left side was wet. She did not need to look down to know why. The fragment from the wall had caught her just below the ribs when the second explosion went off, and she had felt it the way you sometimes feel a serious wound, in the first moments not as pain, but as a sudden awareness that something structural has changed and will not change back on its own. She did not stop moving. Her right hand was pressed hard against the inner thigh of the man lying beside her. His name was Morrow. Petty Officer Second Class Dale Morrow, 29 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of trained muscle, and 12 years of institutional knowledge about how not to die. And right now he was losing consciousness because his femoral artery had been opened by a round that had no interest in any of that. The tourniquet was seated. The cat was locked. She had done it in the dark on a sloped surface with one hand while the building was still shaking. She had done it in 31 seconds. In her left hand was a radio handset. Her voice when she spoke into it was flat and precise. Not calm the way someone is calm when nothing is wrong. Calm the way a person is calm when they have decided completely and without reservation that fear is not a tool they have time for right now. Voss, southeast exit is still clear. Take Finley and move the asset to the alley. Do not use the main corridor. Repeat, do not use the main corridor. I am holding position with Morrow until you have eyes on the LZ. Static. Then, copy Cole, you good? She looked at the strip of black sky through the collapsed ceiling. She looked at her left side at the dark stain spreading slowly through her uniform. She looked at Morrow, whose breathing had steadied, shallow but present. Both hands working, sir. Move. She released the transmit button. Outside, the gunfire was tapering, not ending tapering. There is a difference, and every person who has ever been in a firefight understands it the moment they hear it. Ending means it is over. Tapering means someone is repositioning, and in this case, she knew exactly who was repositioning and where they were going because she had spent 6 hours studying the geometry of this compound before they ever came into it, and she had mapped every line of movement available to every person inside it. She had been in this country for 7 months. She had been attached to SEAL Team 7 for 11 days. In roughly 40 minutes, she would run into a burning building to pull her commander out of it. Nobody on that team had seen that coming. Nobody had seen any of it coming. This is where it started. 72 hours earlier, the sky above FOB Salerno had been a color that does not exist in cities, a deep mineral blue that only happens at altitude in dry air, in a place where human beings were never supposed to build anything permanent. The base sat in Khost Province like something dropped there by accident, surrounded by mountains that had been watching men come and go for centuries with complete indifference. The mountains always won. Every soldier on that base understood this. The good ones let that knowledge make them careful. The great ones let it make them honest. The air at Salerno in late November had a specific quality, dry and cold and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of diesel and dust, and the particular combination of machine oil and burnt propellant that accumulates on any base where weapons are cleaned daily and used regularly. It was the smell of sustained operational tempo, and for the men assigned to SEAL Team 7, it had become as unremarkable as the smell of a kitchen becomes to the people who cook in it every day. They moved through it without noticing. They had been here long enough that the extraordinary had become routine, which is both the great gift and the great danger of experience. Maya arrived on a transport with 3 other support personnel and a pallet of medical supplies. She had a kit that was almost comically large relative to her frame. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 118 pounds on the morning she deployed, though the food situation at Salerno had already trimmed that number by several pounds. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it seemed carved. She had brown eyes that moved constantly, cataloging exits and sightlines and the faces of people who might become important later. She did not look like a threat to anything. She looked like someone the wind could push over. She looked, in the immediate assessment of Petty Officer First Class Ray Decker, like someone's younger sister who had wandered into the wrong building and was too polite to say so. Decker was 34 years old, built like a piece of construction equipment, and had been with SEAL Team 7 for 6 years. He was not a cruel man. He was not even by the standards of his profession an unkind one. He had a wife in Coronado and a son who was 6 years old and already showing the same stubborn physical confidence his father had shown at the same age, and he called them when the comms allowed it, which was not as often as he wanted, but more often than some. He had friends on this team who were closer to him than most relatives. He was, in the ways that mattered outside of operational assessments, a decent human being. But he had spent his adult life in environments where miscalculation was measured in lives, and he had developed through hard experience a precise and unforgiving eye for things that could go wrong. When he looked at Maya Cole standing in the doorway of the briefing room with her oversized kit and her watchful eyes, that eye told him what it always told him when he looked at someone who had not yet proven what they could do under pressure liability. He turned to the man beside him, Petty Officer 3rd Class Finley, 23 years old and still working to prove he belonged here, and said quietly enough that it could have been private, but loudly enough that it was not. Brass sent us a doc for a Tier 2 insertion. Finley said nothing. He looked at his boots. At the front of the room, Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss set down the mission folder and looked at the door without expression. Voss was 46 years old, and he wore those years in the way that men do when they have spent most of them in difficult places making difficult decisions. There was a scar along his jaw from a piece of shrapnel that had come close enough to change everything and settled for changing only the surface. His eyes were the pale gray of a November sky over the Atlantic, and they had a quality that new operators sometimes found unsettling. Not coldness exactly, but a kind of penetrating patience, as though he was always waiting for you to reveal the thing he had already decided you were. He did not arrive at conclusions quickly. When he arrived, they were usually right. He had come to that patience through a progression of difficult postings and harder decisions. He had served in places that appeared on maps only in classified briefings. He had made calls that had been right and calls that had been wrong, and calls that were both at the same time depending on how you measured the outcome. And he had learned over the course of that service to hold all of it, the right calls and the wrong ones, with equal honesty, because the alternative was the kind of selective memory that turned operators into liabilities and commanders into cautionary tales. He had also come to the question of medical personnel the hard way. 3 years earlier, on a different deployment in a different country, a different corpsman, experienced, decorated, well-regarded by everyone who had served with him, had made a field decision that seemed reasonable under pressure and had cost one of Voss's men the use of his right leg for the rest of his life. The corpsman had not been wrong exactly. He had made the best call available with the information he had under conditions that degraded every variable. But the outcome had lodged itself in Voss's chest with the permanence that belongs only to things that happen to people you are responsible for, and since then he had maintained toward all medical attachments a watchfulness that was not hostile, but was never at any point fully relaxed. He looked at Maya Cole standing in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Corpsman Cole, you have 24 hours to show me you can keep up. That is not a standard I apply to you specifically. That is the standard. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Good. Take a seat." She took a seat. She opened the mission folder before anyone else in the room had reached for theirs, and she began to read with the focused attentiveness of someone who is reading to understand rather than to comply. Voss noticed. He said nothing. Chief Petty Officer Leonard Harwick was 51 years old and carried the kind of quiet that accumulates in a person over decades of careful attention. He had been with SEAL teams for 22 years, long enough that the institution had stopped being something he served and had become something he was made of, the way calcium becomes bone. He had deployed 9 times. He had been shot twice, neither time seriously enough to take him off active duty for more than 6 weeks. He had buried 4 men he loved, and he had done it with the particular controlled grief of someone who knows that the grief is real, but that the expression of it has to be managed carefully because other people are watching and learning from how you handle it. He had served alongside men who became legends and men who became cautionary tales, and he had learned over the long course of that service that the difference between the two was rarely about physical capability. It was almost always about something harder to measure and easier to underestimate, about judgment, about the gap between what you want to do and what the situation actually requires, about the willingness to stay honest when honesty is expensive. He was the last person to enter the briefing room, and when he came through the door and his eyes moved across the assembled team in the automatic sweep that had long since become involuntary, they stopped on the name tape stitched above the left breast pocket of the small, dark-haired corpsman in the 3rd row. Cole. He had known a Cole. He had known the Cole Master Chief Daniel Cole, signed Iron SEAL Team 5, a man who had humped gear through the jungles of Panama in 1989 during Operation Just Cause and through the burning oil fields of Kuwait in 1991, and through a dozen other places that did not appear in any official record and were not going to. A man who was in Harwick's private and carefully maintained accounting of the people he had known, the finest operator he had ever stood beside. Not the most physically imposing, not the most decorated, the finest. The one who made the right call when the right call was hardest, who saw the angle nobody else saw, who could be still, when everything else was moving and moving when everything else was still, and who had taught the people around him simply by being consistently himself what it looked like to do this work the way it was supposed to be done. Iron had retired to Montana several years back. Retired men like Iron did not generally seek out the people they had served with, because some things are carried better in silence than in company. But Harwick thought about him. He thought about him every time he ran into something in the field that Iron would have handled differently and better, which happened more often than he would have liked. Harwick stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he found a seat near the back and said nothing to Maya Cole during the briefing. When it was over and the team was filtering out, he came up beside her as she was securing her folder. "Corman Cole." She looked up. "Your grandfather, Daniel Cole." He stated it the way you state something you already know is true. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, the straight-back posture, the stillness, the eyes already moving past him to the doorway to the courtyard, to the mountains beyond. He had seen eyes like that before. He had seen them in a photograph once of a 23-year-old SEAL standing in the mud somewhere in Panama, grinning at the camera with the confidence of a man who had not yet learned what he would lose. Harwick nodded once. "Good operator," he said. "Your grandfather." He walked away before she could respond. The mission briefing laid out the problem in the flat technical language that the military uses to drain urgency from things that are urgent. Because urgency in a briefing room is a kind of noise, and noise makes it harder to think. The problem, stripped of its language, was this: somewhere in a valley 40 kilometers west of Salerno, a CIA asset named Renner was being held by a Taliban-affiliated cell in a compound guarded by approximately 12 armed personnel with reliable communications infrastructure and a defensive posture that suggested they expected an extraction attempt, but were uncertain of its timing. There was an 18-hour window before the cell was expected to move Renner to an unknown secondary location, after which he and the intelligence he carried would be inaccessible indefinitely. SEAL Team 7 would insert by helicopter at 0200, approach the target on foot, neutralize the defensive positions, extract the asset, and withdraw to an LZ 4 kilometers north for extraction. Clean, practiced, accounted for. The briefing lasted 45 minutes. Maya asked 2 questions, both about the medical situation at the extraction point, both precise, both demonstrating a level of operational forethought that was inconsistent with the picture Decker had formed of her in the first 30 seconds. He noticed this without acknowledgement. He filed it in the part of his mind that managed information he was not yet ready to update his conclusions with. Then they went to prepare. It was always simple in the briefing room. The preparation for the mission took up the remaining daylight and most of the evening, and it was during this time that Maya Cole began to work. Not with a weapon. She moved through the team the way water moves through a system, finding the lowest points, filling them quietly without announcement. She checked hydration levels, nutrition intake, the small physical symptoms that accumulate in men who push themselves hard and sleep badly and eat whatever is available. She asked questions that seemed like routine medical screening. They were not routine. She was building a picture, and when she was done with each man, she filed what she had learned in the part of her mind reserved for things that matter, and she moved to the next one. She got to Morrow last. Dale Morrow was 29 years old and had the confidence of a man whose body had never seriously failed him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and when Maya approached him with her kit and her level gaze, his expression said politely but clearly that this was not necessary. She asked him 4 questions. When did you last eat a full meal? What color was your urine this morning? Have you experienced any unusual muscle cramping in the last 24 hours? And where exactly is the tightness you have been carrying in your lower back since Tuesday? That last one landed differently. Morrow's eyes changed. Not much. Enough. How did you... You have been shifting your weight to your left side since I walked in. Right hip compensating for lumbar tension. Sit down, please. He sat. She worked in silence for several minutes, pressing with practiced fingers along muscle groups that told her things his face had decided not to. What she found was not what she had been looking for, and the combination of findings changed her expression, from calm attentiveness to something sharper and more purposeful. She stood up. I need to speak with Commander Voss. Morrow, it's nothing. I'm fine. You have early-stage rhabdomyolysis. Your muscles are breaking down faster than your kidneys can process the byproducts. At the current rate, you will lose functional capacity within 5 to 6 hours of sustained exertion. That means approximately halfway through the approach to the target, you stop being a functional member of this team. She picked up her kit. I need to speak with Commander Voss. The room had gone quiet. She found Voss at the planning table and laid it out for him in the same flat, precise language, because this was a briefing room and because urgency was noise, and she did not have the luxury of noise. Voss listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Fix it. I need 40 minutes and an IV line." "You have 40 minutes?" She had him stable in 38. She used a balanced crystalloid solution, adjusted the electrolyte ratio based on Morrow's body weight, and estimated fluid deficit, and monitored his response with close continuous attention that cannot be faked and cannot be hurried. When it was done, Morrow's color had improved, and the compensatory shift in his stance had resolved, and he was in her clinical assessment fit for duty. She explained this to Voss in the same flat tone. He was quiet for a moment. "Then where did you train?" "Naval Medical Center, San Diego, sir. And before that, I had a very good teacher." Voss looked at her. She did not elaborate. She picked up her kit and walked back to the preparation area. Decker had watched the entire exchange from across the room. He was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, less settled, more interior, like a man reconsidering an argument that he had been certain of an hour ago. He said nothing. Not yet. It was 3 hours before departure, and the FOB had reached that pitch of controlled tension that precedes night operations. Everyone moving with purpose, speaking less the noise of the day, giving way to something quieter and more focused. The team was checking and rechecking gear, final communications checks, final mission review. Finley was at the staging area running through his equipment with the accelerated thoroughness of a man who is not going to let anyone see that his hands are not entirely steady. He had been on 4 missions. This was his 5th. The 5th one, someone had told him early in his career, is when you stop being lucky and start being good, and the space between those two things was where he currently lived. He was checking his rifle when the bolt carrier group jammed. A simple failure to feed the kind that happens with enough dirt and enough cold and enough bad luck. He ran the immediate action drill. Nothing. He ran it again. The weapon stayed locked. He was 3 minutes into it when a hand appeared over his shoulder. Small, dark-sleeved, moving with absolute certainty. It took the rifle from him without asking. Brought it to a workbench. In the next 11 seconds, he counted them later, not because the number mattered, but because he needed something to hold on to. The rifle was disassembled, inspected, diagnosed, corrected, reassembled, and function checked. Handed back. Maya Cole was already walking away. Finley stood with his rifle in his hands and looked at it. Then at her retreating figure. Then at Chief Harwick, who was standing nearby and had seen everything. "Chief." Harwick did not look at him. He was watching Maya disappear around the corner of the equipment shed. "Don't ask, just watch." The lighting outside the equipment shed was a single overhead bulb on a motion-activated fixture, the kind that throws hard shadows and washes color from everything it touches. It came on as Harwick walked past, and for a moment the light caught something on Maya's left wrist that softer conditions might have missed. A scar. Not a wound scar, not the kind from accidents or surgeries. This was the kind that forms from repetition, from the physics of a firearms action, under recoil repeated thousands of times over years, leaving its mark on skin the way water leaves its mark on stone. The kind of scar that only forms when a person has spent an enormous number of hours with a rifle pressed against a frame that was not designed to absorb it and absorbed it anyway because the instruction was to absorb it, and the instruction came from someone worth listening to. Harwick looked at the scar. He thought about a summer afternoon in Montana 20 years ago. A field dry grass, a man whose patience was legendary, standing behind a 10-year-old girl who was holding a rifle that was larger than she was, and learning for the first time to feel the wind. He looked at the patch stitched to the side of Maya's kit, 4 letters hand-stitched in black thread on navy blue iron. He went back inside and finished preparing for the mission. The helicopters lifted from FOB Salerno at 0200 hours, and the mountains swallowed them almost immediately. Below the rotor's coast province existed in its nighttime state a darkness that was layered the visible spectrum, replaced by 1,000 shades of thermal gradient and shadow. The pilots flew low and fast along a route that followed the contours of the terrain rather than the logic of maps, and the team rode in the compressed silence of men who have run out of things to say and have not yet arrived at the moment when words will be necessary again. Maya sat at the end of the left bench. Her kit was secured between her feet. Her hands rested on her knees still in the natural way of a person whose nervous system had decided that stillness was appropriate, not the forced stillness of someone managing fear. Her eyes were open. She was thinking about a morning in Montana in the summer of 1992. She had been 10 years old and the dry grass in the field behind her grandfather's house had come up to her waist, and he had been standing behind her with his hand light on her shoulder, telling her something about the wind, about how you had to learn to read it before you tried to work with it, about how the wind was not your enemy unless you treated it like one. She had asked him, what if there's no wind? And he had said, there's always wind, mija. You just have to learn to feel it. The helicopter banked hard left. The mountains came up on both sides. Ahead, invisible in the darkness, 40 kilometers to the west, a compound waited with 12 armed men in a window that was already down to 14 hours. Maya's hands stayed still on her knees. Outside the open door, Afghanistan passed below at 120 knots, invisible, but present, communicating itself through the cold air coming off the mountains and the way the helicopter moved through it, adjusting constantly to terrain that changed without announcement. She had been in this country for 7 months and had learned to read the air, the way sailors learn to read water, by paying attention long enough that the reading becomes involuntary, something that happens in the body before it reaches the mind. The helicopter dropped toward the valley floor, and the door came open wider, and the cold came in like something alive and specific. Decker went first. Harwick, Finley, then Morrow, who moved cleanly and without hesitation, which was what 40 minutes of Maya's IV work and a man's own considerable stubbornness had produced. Then Voss, who paused at the door for exactly 1 second, the pause of a commander making his final count, and then was gone. Then Maya Cole stepped out of the helicopter and into the dark with her kit on her back and her steady hands in the name of a living man stitched above her hip, and the Coast Province received her the way it received everything, without comment, without ceremony, with complete indifference to whatever she carried or hoped for or was about to become. The helicopter lifted and swung south and was gone before the sound of it had fully registered. The team was alone with the mountains. Somewhere ahead in the cold and the dark, the mission was waiting. Everything was about to change. The approach to the target took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of moving through darkness that had weight and texture and temperature, through terrain that pushed back against every step with loose stone and uneven grade and the specific hostility of ground that has never been maintained and does not intend to start. The air was cold enough that exhaled breath was visible, even in near total darkness. A small betrayal that experienced operators learned to manage by keeping their breathing controlled and angled down. The temperature had dropped 3 degrees since they landed, and the moisture content was wrong, too dry for this time of year, which meant the wind would be unpredictable, carrying shifts that instruments would catch late and experienced lungs might catch earlier. Maya noticed the air. She stored the information. The team moved in file formation, spaced the way training and experience, and the memory of what happens when you bunch up had taught them far enough apart that a single burst could not take more than one of them close enough to maintain visual contact in the available light, which was almost none. There was no moon. The stars were out, but they were high and cold and did not offer much to work with at ground level. Harwick was on point, moving the way a man does when his body has developed its own opinions about how this should be done, and those opinions have proven correct enough times that they are no longer subject to revision. Behind him came Finley, then Decker, then Morrow, then Voss. Maya was last in the file. She was watching everything. She watched the ridge line to the north where the terrain was broken enough to provide concealment for anyone who wanted to observe without being seen. She watched the lower ground to the east where a seasonal streambed cut a natural corridor that anyone approaching from the Pakistan border would use if they knew this area, and anyone who had been operating in this area for years certainly did. She watched the ground immediately around her feet, because the ground immediately around your feet is where the things that end missions are buried. She had been taught to watch all of these things simultaneously by a man who had learned to do it in places that still carried classified designations 20 years after the fact. She had practiced it until the watching became automatic, something that happened whether she asked it to or not, running in the background, like breathing, like a heart rate, like the continuous unconscious monitoring that keeps a living body oriented in a world that is always trying to reorient it. The compound appeared at the edge of Harwick's night optics at 0318. A low structure of reinforced mud brick, the kind built in this part of the world for centuries and designed to outlast everything the centuries could throw at it. A perimeter wall on 3 sides, a natural rock face forming the 4th, eliminating the need for construction on the most defensible side and suggesting that whoever built this compound had understood their ground. Two visible sentry positions on the wall spaced with the deliberate irregularity that signals actual training rather than guesswork. Light from two windows, dim irregular, suggesting oil lamps, or low-grade battery power on a circuit that was being conserved. A satellite dish on the roof that was decades newer than everything around it. Voss called the team to ground behind a long shelf of rock 200 meters from the wall. He studied the compound through his optics for 2 minutes, not one, not 90 seconds, 2 full minutes, and then he outlined the approach in the condensed sequential language that leaves no room for interpretation. Harwick and Finley through the east gap, Decker and Morrow through the main gate after Harwick had cleared the sentry positions, Voss to follow Decker Maya to hold at the east wall until called forward. The plan was clean. It was practiced. It accounted for every variable that could be accounted for. Which is also why the moment they made contact with the real situation, it began to come apart. They had been watched. Not from the compound from behind. From the ridgeline, Maya had been watching for 40 minutes, and from the streambed to the east, she had also been watching, and from a third position to the south that no one had identified because no one had known it was there. That is the nature of ambushes. They are built specifically around the things you do not know. The first shots came from the ridge. They came without warning, so without the half-second of acoustic confusion that sometimes gives you time to react before your body understands what it is hearing. They came accurate, coordinated from three directions. In the first 4 seconds, the team had scattered to the nearest available cover. Voss was on the radio, Harwick was returning fire toward the ridge, and Finley was flat on his stomach behind a rock that was approximately half as large as he needed it to be. Morrow went down in the second. Maya saw it happen with that strange, slowed clarity that the brain produces in high-stress situations because it is trying to give you enough time to do something useful. His right leg folded under him, and he went sideways, and she knew from the location of the impact and the immediate behavior of the leg what had happened before she was close enough to confirm it. Femoral artery. She was already moving. The distance between her position and Morrow's was 12 meters of open ground, with rounds moving through it at velocities that made the air feel unstable. She crossed it low and fast without allowing herself to think about it, because thinking about it would have made her slower and slower was the one thing she could not afford. She reached him. His face was the color of old chalk. His hands were on his leg with the instinctive pressure the body applies to a catastrophic wound before the conscious mind has fully processed it. She moved his hands. The tourniquet was out of her kit in 3 seconds. Seated above the wound site, cat-locked in 31. She had done it faster in training. She had done it in better conditions. But it was done and it was correct, and the rate of blood loss changed immediately in the way that means a tourniquet has done its job. Morrow's eyes found her face. "You're going to stay with me," she said. Not a comfort, a directive. He nodded. His color was still wrong. It would stay wrong for a while. But he was stable enough to leave for 60 seconds, and she was already understanding that she might need those 60 seconds for something else. Because Voss was on the radio, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not fear, something more specific and more controlled than fear, the tone of a commander who has identified a problem, run the available solutions, and found that the available solutions do not add up to enough. Sniper, rooftop northeast building, 800 meters. Thermal signature confirmed. I have no angle. Repeat, no angle on this target. All positions, no angle. The radio went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when a man has run the options and the options have run out. Decker's voice came back first low and controlled. Harwick, can you move northeast 40 meters? Negative, I'm pinned, cannot move. Finley, same position, no angle. Voss did not respond immediately. Maya, holding pressure on Morrow's leg, could see his silhouette behind the rubble, the stillness of a commander when the mathematics of a situation have produced an answer he cannot use. She had seen that stillness before on other men in other places. She knew what it meant. It meant we are out of moves. It meant someone is going to die here if nothing changes in the next few seconds. That stillness lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In a firefight with a sniper holding elevation on your position, 4 seconds is long enough to understand that the next 4 will be worse. Then Maya moved. She looked at Morrow. She looked at his tourniquet, seated correctly, locked the tissue above it, showing the early signs of doing its job. She calculated the time she could leave him without the outcome changing. Then she felt something land near her hand. She looked down. A lens cap, small black, the kind that fits over the objective end of a rifle scope. On its surface, in letters worn smooth by years of handling, but still readable, a name had been engraved in the metal. Iron Coal. She looked up. Across 20 feet of broken ground behind a shelf of rock that gave him partial cover, Chief Harwick was watching her. He had carried that lens cap for 2 years. He had not explained to anyone why he carried it. He did not explain it now. He held her gaze for 1 second. He nodded. She looked at the M24 SWS lying in the dirt where Morrow had fallen. A 10-pound precision rifle, Schmidt and Bender scope adjustments, she would have to make in the dark based on conditions she could only partially measure. She looked at the rooftop 800 meters away. She pressed the transmit button. Commander Voss, a half second. Cole, status on Morrow. Stable, tourniquet in place. He can hold for 90 seconds without me. A pause of exactly the right length. Give me 20 seconds, sir. Decker's voice on the team frequency, she can't. Voss's voice came across it. Not loud. The silence before it lasted 3 full seconds, which is a long time when people are shooting at you. In that silence, Maya understood that he was not deciding whether she was capable. He was deciding whether he was willing to find out. He was also looking at Harwick. And Harwick, behind his shelf of rock in the darkness, had made his answer visible in the way he was looking back. 20 seconds, Voss said. Go. She picked up the M24. She moved to a gap in the rubble 18 inches wide, a line of sight to the northeast rooftop with minimal exposure in return. She set the bipod. She brought the scope to her eye and acquired the target. The rooftop sniper was prone. He had a good position and he knew it. He was using it with the patience of a man who understands that patience is the primary qualification for the job. Maya's angle gave her a different range than Voss had called, closer to 650 meters, not 800, which meant the wind calculation changed. She read the wind, not with instruments, with the fine hairs on the back of her hand, the movement of dust against the rock face, the memory of every lesson she had ever received about the relationship between what you can feel and what you cannot see. She controlled her breathing, in for 4 counts, out slowly, heart rate dropping on the exhale. She put the crosshairs on center mass. She squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. The shot broke clean. The round traveled the distance in just under a second and struck the parapet wall 6 inches left of the target. 6 inches. She heard Decker's voice on the radio. She did not process the words. She was already adjusting not the scope, which was calibrated correctly. The wind had shifted in the 3 seconds between her initial read and the trigger break. A minor change in direction, significant at distance. She had felt it a moment too late. She felt it now. She settled her breathing again. She thought about a field in Montana and a man standing behind her telling her to feel the wind before she felt the trigger. She let that voice come in and she listened to it the way she had been listening to it since she was 10 years old, standing in dry grass with a rifle that was larger than she was. She felt the wind. She squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. The rooftop sniper stopped moving. The silence on the team frequency lasted 4 seconds. 4 full seconds in which the firefight continued, but the radio was completely still, as though everyone on it had simultaneously decided to wait before speaking. Voss's voice came first. Who took that shot? Not a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the voice of a man stating something out loud, because stating it is the only way to confirm that what he observed is what he actually observed. Harwick's voice, quiet and unhurried. Doc. Another silence, shorter. Then Voss, team push on the compound, Harwick on me, Decker northeast perimeter. The firefight narrowed and intensified, and the team moved the way trained people move when an objective becomes possible again, with the compressed, efficient urgency of professionals who have recalibrated around new information. Maya set the M24 down and returned to Morrow. She checked the tourniquet, checked his pulse, checked his color, and made 3 adjustments that improved 2 of those 3 things. She assessed that he could be moved, but could not bear weight on the leg. She flagged this for Finley with a hand signal and a look, and Finley, who had been watching her since he handed back his rifle, understood immediately and moved into position to take Morrow's weight. The compound was secured 40 minutes after first contact. The CIA SM, Renner, was found in a rear room in a condition that was worse than the mission brief had described, and better than it could have been. He was alive. He was coherent enough to confirm his identity. He needed medical attention that Maya was already in the process of providing before Voss had finished issuing the post-contact instructions. They moved to a temporary holding position 200 meters north of the compound, a rock formation offering cover on 3 sides and a sight line on the 4th, while Voss coordinated extraction and the team began to process what had happened. Decker sat with his back against a rock rifle across his knees and said nothing for approximately 4 minutes. Then where did you learn that? He was looking at Maya. She was working on Renner's forearm without looking up. My grandfather taught me. Name, Master Chief Daniel Cole, SEAL Team 5. The formation was quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of Harwick running a comms check with the extraction team. Decker was still looking at Maya, His face had undergone a rearrangement, same features, different message. He was a man who did not arrive at uncertainty quickly. When he arrived, it showed. Across the formation, Finley caught Morrow's eye. Morrow on his back with the wounded leg extended and Finley's jacket folded under his head, gave a small nod that meant something that did not need words. Voss had finished with the radio. He crossed to Harwick, and when he was close enough for the conversation to stay between them, you knew. Harwick kept his eyes on the eastern approach. I knew her name. That's not the same thing. No, Harwick said. It isn't. Why didn't she disclose the training? Harwick was quiet for a moment. That's the question you should ask her. Voss looked at him for a few seconds. Then he crossed the formation to where Maya was working. She heard him coming. She did not stop working. He crouched nearby and waited for the natural pause in what she was doing, and when it came, he said, Corman Cole, tell me about your grandfather. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of hesitation, but of a person deciding what to give and in what order. He started teaching me when I was 10, she said. Every summer in Montana, we'd be in the field before sunrise. He had a Remington 700 he'd been shooting since before I was born, and the first thing he did every summer was make me sit with it for an hour without trying to fire it. Just sit with it. He said you had to understand the weight of what you were holding before you asked it to do anything. Voss said nothing. He taught me the mechanics first, then the math ballistics, drop tables, environmental variables, then the physical discipline, breathing, heart rate, trigger control. He was patient. He never rushed any of it. She finished with Renner's forearm and moved to the next problem. He's still alive. He lives in Montana. He's 71 years old with a bad hip, and he still goes out to that field every morning because he says the field is the only place that still makes sense to him. Voss waited. Before I deployed, he sat down with my mother and me at his kitchen table. He looked at me for a long time without saying anything. And then he said, I am asking you to promise me you will not carry a rifle in this war, that you will heal the ones who need healing, that you will let the ones trained for the other thing do the other thing. A pause. He knew what he had trained me to do. He asked me to promise anyway. Because my mother was sitting right there at that table, and she had already lost my father in Iraq in 2005, and he was not going to watch her sit there in silence without asking. You promised, Voss said. I promised. She looked at her hands. The blood on them was not hers. There was no one else, she said. Not an explanation. A statement of the situation as it had existed. The shot had to be taken. There was no one else. She looked at him directly. Heal when you can, she said. Fight when you must. He used to say that. It was the closest thing to a rule he had. Voss held her gaze. He was thinking about a different medic 3 years ago, and about the watchfulness he had carried since then, the careful, unrelaxed wariness he had applied to every medical attachment without being able to stop. He was thinking about what it means to carry a judgment forward past the point where it fits. He thought about a 6-inch miss that got corrected in 4 seconds. He thought about a second shot 650 meters in a crosswind with an unfamiliar rifle. Your grandfather, he said finally, is a very good teacher. He stood. He held her gaze for one more moment, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be a conclusion, and then he went back to the radio. Across the formation, Decker had watched the exchange without appearing to. He was past the point of forming quick judgments about what he was seeing. Something had shifted inside him slowly, and without announcement, the way things shift when the information you are receiving has exceeded the capacity of the framework you built to receive it. He was thinking about a name he had heard since he was new to SEAL teams, spoken in the tone reserved for things you did not personally witness, but understand to be true. Master Chief Daniel Cole. Iron. The thing he had done in Kuwait in 1991, the specific thing that Decker had heard described twice and had not quite believed either time, and both times had believed completely. He looked at the small, dark-haired corpsman across the formation, whose hands did not shake, and who had put a round through the dark at 650 meters after a wind shift with a rifle that was not hers and a shoulder that was already going to need attention. He looked at her for a long time. He said nothing. But something behind his face was changing, and Harwick, who noticed everything, saw it and stored it in the careful interior archive where he kept everything that would matter later. The Overwatch check came through at 0441. 2 vehicles approaching from the north. Technical configuration, heavy weapon mount on the lead truck. Range 1,100 meters in closing. Voss assessed the timeline. He ran the math. He looked at the terrain between their position and the LZ. He did not look at Maya. He did not need to. She was already at the edge of the formation, already with the M24, already going through the sequence. He had now watched her complete once in the dark, with a shifted wind and a rifle that was not hers, and which he now understood with the clarity of a commander who has had to revise his picture of a situation and has revised it completely, would be completed correctly. Her left shoulder had taken a fragment at some point during the initial contact. She had not mentioned it. She had not stopped using it. She had done what she needed to do with it and placed the problem of pain in the category of things that could wait. Both hands working. She set the bipod. She acquired the lead vehicle in the scope. The gunner on the mount was visible standing in the open turret, braced against the motion of the truck, a silhouette that resolved in the scope to a specific person at a distance of 1,120 meters. She read the wind in 2 layers, a ground-level current from the northwest and a slightly stronger flow 15 feet up, moving at a different vector. She read both. She did not hurry. Heart rate down to 68. The left shoulder was sending reports upward that her brain noted and filed as information, not instruction. One shot. The gunner on the lead vehicle stopped standing. The truck stopped moving. The second vehicle stopped behind it. In the stillness that followed, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Morrow, flat on his back, color still. Wrong eyes clear and tracking everything, said it the way you say something when it has moved past observation into a different category entirely. Steady hands, Doc. Maya set the rifle down. She rolled her left shoulder once carefully and noted what the shoulder sent back. Then she picked up her kit and went back to Renner. The team held the formation. They held it with the quality that a group of people acquires when something has happened in their presence, that they are still in the process of understanding, not loudly, not with the performance of revelation, but with the quiet interior rearrangement of people who have seen something that has changed the shape of what they know. The extraction was 6 minutes out, and the hardest part of the night was still ahead. The extraction helicopter was 6 minutes out when everything changed again. It changed the way things change in the field when you have spent everything you thought you had and the situation reaches back and asks for more. Not dramatically, not with announcement, with the quiet, indifferent logic of a situation that does not care what you have already been through or what it cost you to get here. Harwick heard it first. A structural sound from the direction of the compound's eastern outbuilding, not an explosion but the precursor to one, a low, resonant creak that spoke of heat, stress in material that had not been designed to contain whatever was now inside it. He turned toward it and saw the orange edge of firelight beginning at the base of the far wall. Not a large fire yet, the kind of fire that is still deciding how serious it intends to be. He was on the radio in the same breath. Voss East Building, fire origin unknown, taking the asset north to the exfil corridor. Voss acknowledged and moved immediately toward the eastern edge of the compound, through the gap in the perimeter wall they had cleared on entry, and Maya was behind him because wherever the situation was developing was where she needed to be. The fire had made its decision. It was coming from the outbuilding, a low rectangular structure that had apparently served as a fuel storage point. The rate of growth said it had found something substantial to feed on. The flames were moving laterally along the base and beginning to climb, and the heat was already serious enough to feel at 20 meters. The compound's east wall had partially collapsed, not from the firefight, but from some earlier event. A previous strike or simple structural failure, and the falling masonry had created a problem that no one had planned for. A large section of reinforced concrete lintel, still attached at one end to the standing wall and resting at the other end on the rubble-covered ground, had come down across the only viable path between the burning outbuilding and the open ground to the north. Voss was on that path. He had gone through first because that was who he was, and the lintel had given way while he was beneath it, coming down across his lower right leg with the precision of something that had not been aimed but might as well have been. He had gone to one knee and tried to stand. He could not. He tried again. The rubble shifted, but the lintel held. His face carried the specific expression of a man who has run the available options and arrived at the understanding that the available options do not include getting out of this without help. The fire was 25 meters to his left, moving toward him. Maya was already through the gap. She assessed the situation in the 3 seconds of movement between the gap and Voss's position, the angle of the lintel, the weight distribution of the rubble, the likely points of leverage, the temperature of the air, and how fast it was climbing, the time available before the fire made every calculation irrelevant. She did this the way she did everything, not as a series of steps, but as a single integrated read, the same clarity that worked at 600 meters. Working here at 6, the same patience applied to a completely different kind of problem. There were no tools. There was her, and there was Voss, and there was the lintel, and there was the fire. She got down beside him and looked at the pinned leg. The lintel was bearing down on the right calf, not crushing it outright, but holding it with enough weight that a direct pull would cause injury, compromising his ability to move under his own power. She needed to shift the load. She needed to shift it enough to create a gap of approximately 4 inches, which would allow him to extract the leg cleanly if he rotated his hip at the same moment she lifted. She put her hands on the lintel. The left hand, the one with the fragment, wound in the shoulder above it, the one that had been on the bipod twice tonight and had sent its reports faithfully each time, did what she asked of it, not comfortably. But it was one of the things she had learned from a man who had pressed her at 10 years old and 14 and 17, past the point where her body was voting for stopping the distance between what you can do and what you have already done is almost always larger than it feels in the moment. On 3, she said, rotate your hip right when I lift. Rotate, don't pull. Pulling makes it worse. Voss looked at her. He was tracking. Present. Ready. The weight of a reinforced concrete lintel is not a number. A 118-pound person is supposed to move without equipment. The engineering tables would have been correct here, except the lintel was not being asked to move, only to shift. To rotate slightly at its attached end, redistributing its load enough to reduce the bearing weight at the one specific point where Voss's leg was pinned. 4 inches. She moved at 4 inches. She moved it while the fire at 25 meters became the fire at 20 meters, and the heat differential against the left side of her face went from serious to dangerous. She moved it while the smoke shifted the way smoke shifts when a source intensifies, filling the compound air with it. She moved it while Voss rotated his hip on 3, and his right leg came free, and he was on his feet beside her, in the same motion, his right hand coming down on her shoulder because the leg would hold weight, but not smoothly, not yet. They went north together. Not running, moving, which is sometimes faster, because running in poor visibility on uncertain ground, with a compromised leg and a shoulder that has been asked too much of already, is how you turn one problem into 2. She had his right side, one hand under his arm, one hand on her kit. He had his weight distributed the way a person distributes it when they have made the internal assessment and decided 1 foot will hold. They came out through the north edge of the compound into clean, cold air. At the same moment, the outbuilding's roof came down behind them. The sound was enormous and close and final. The wave of heat arrived 2 seconds later, warm against their backs as they moved away from it. Finley was at the north perimeter. He saw them come out and move toward Voss's left side without being asked, because he had been watching things all night that were changing the shape of what he thought was possible, and he was paying attention. Decker was on the outer perimeter, covering the approach from the south. He heard the roof come down. He looked back over his shoulder once. He saw them emerge, Maya and Voss together, smoke behind them, the fire painting the low clouds orange above the compound wall. He turned back to his sector. He held what he was feeling in the way you hold something that requires the right words and the right quiet around them, and you wait for that moment, and you keep doing your job because the mission is not over, and the people on it are still your responsibility. Harwick had reached the LZ with Renner. Morrow was being carried in a fireman's carry by Finley, not efficiently, but adequately. Renner was ambulatory with assistance. When Voss assessed the full picture as the team consolidated at the LZ, this was what he had: everyone alive, everyone moving, asset secured, mission accomplished. The cost had been real. The night had been long. There would be time later to account for what it had taken. The helicopter came in from the south, low and fast, and the downwash hit them as it flared and settled. They loaded in the practice sequence of a team that has done this enough times that the choreography survives even nights like this one. Then they were up. The compound was below them, the fire in the outbuilding, a bright scar on the dark ground, the mountains rising, and then the helicopter rising above them, and then the mountains were gone, and they were gone with them. Maya sat at the end of the left bench. Her left shoulder was going to need proper attention. Her side needed stitching. Her right palm had second-degree redness from the surface temperature of the lintel in the seconds before she moved it. She had cataloged all of these things in the same patient interior way she cataloged everything, placed them in the category of things that can wait, and moved on. Now she sat in the helicopter with rotor noise around her and cold air coming through the door seals and the darkness of Coast Province falling away below. Morrow was across from her. He had been watching her on and off since before they lifted, with the attention of a man whose understanding of a situation has undergone a significant revision and who is still working through what the revision means. He said it the way you say something when accuracy is what the moment requires and you have finally identified the most accurate thing available. Both hands, he said. Not steady hands, not what he had said at the rock formation after the second shot when he was still operating from surprise. This was different. This was the version that comes after you have seen the whole picture and understood what it means. Both hands. She looked at him. She nodded once. Voss at the far end of the bench had his right leg extended, and was running the continuous low-level monitoring of a commander accounting for his team after action. His eyes moved from face to face. They stopped on Maya and held there for a moment. Then he looked at his right leg, then at his hands. He would need time to sit with what he was feeling. It was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, something more complicated than that. The feeling that comes when you have been wrong about something in a way that cost people more than it needed to, and you know it, and the person you were wrong about has just run into a burning building to make sure you got out of it. FOB Salerno came up below them and the helicopter descended, and the lights of the base were bright after the total darkness of the valley. Rear Admiral Stuart Bellum was standing on the tarmac. He was 63 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the width that comes from decades of physical service and does not fully leave when the service slows. He had the face of a man who has been outdoors in difficult conditions for most of his life, lined weathered, carrying the specific weight of someone who has made many decisions and knows that some of them will stay with him. He had come to FOB Salerno for a scheduled inspection and had been there when the reports from Voss's team began coming in, and he had listened to those reports with the full attention of a man who has spent 30 years learning to hear what is not said alongside what is. He watched the team come off the helicopter. He watched Harwick with Renner. He watched Finley bringing Morrow on a makeshift carry. He watched Voss come down with an uneven gait and the contained expression of a man managing a leg that will require attention. And he watched the small, dark-haired corpsman, who came off last walking without assistance, left shoulder slightly off level, right palm, reddened along the grip line, eyes already on Morrow's leg, with the automatic attentiveness of someone who has not stopped working and does not intend to. He read the name tape from 10 feet. Cole. He had known that name for more than 30 years. He had known it since the Persian Gulf in 1991 when he had been a junior officer, and there had been a master chief attached to his team who had done something in the waters off Kuwait that Stuart Bellum still described, when he described it at all, as the finest piece of individual operator work he had personally witnessed in 3 decades of service. He stood in front of Maya Cole. She stopped. She came to attention without making a production of it, the clean automatic response of a person trained in the appropriate behavior when addressed by a flag officer performed here with the additional quality of someone managing 3 separate injuries in a physical debt that would take days to repay. Bellum looked at her for a long moment. Master Chief Daniel Cole served in the Gulf when I was a junior officer, he said. I have been in this uniform for 31 years, Corpsman Cole, and in that time I have met 3 people who made me think differently about what this work is. He was one of them. He paused. I was wrong about the number. Maya held his gaze. Her face was what it had been all night, composed, present, receiving. He placed his hand on her right shoulder. Wanda Hanna, not a formal gesture, not a performance. The kind of contact one person makes with another when words have reached their limit and the remaining vocabulary is physical. He stepped back. Morrow, on the carry from which he would not be climbing down under his own power for some time, raised his right hand. She saved my life, sir. He said it the way he had been holding it, waiting for exactly this moment to put it where it belonged. Both hands. Bellum nodded once. He looked at Voss, who said nothing because he had already reported what had happened with the flat precision of operational reporting, and the flat precision had communicated between its technical lines exactly what needed to be communicated to a man with 31 years of practice reading those lines. Bellum walked back toward the operations building. The tarmac was cold and bright. Harwick was with the intel officers. Finley was helping the medics with Morrow. Decker was standing 20 feet from Maya, and he had been standing there for a while. He crossed the distance. He stopped in front of her and looked at her directly the way he did most things, without approach or softening, without the cushioning of eye contact that people use when they want to make something easier to receive. He was not trying to make this easier. He was trying to make it honest. Cole, she looked at him. I was wrong from the first moment, he said. I looked at you when you walked in the door, and I made a decision based on what I saw, and what I saw was not what was there. I have been operating on that decision every day since, and everything that happened tonight, every single thing, was something that was there from the beginning that I missed because I decided in the first 30 seconds that I already knew what you were. He held her gaze without looking away. I was wrong. I am telling you that directly because you are owed it directly, and because there is no version of saying it indirectly that is actually saying it. Maya looked at him for a moment. I hear you, Decker, she said. Not that it was fine, not that she understood, or that she would have done the same. She heard him. That was what she said, and it was true, and it was enough, and the fact that it was enough without requiring anything more was something he would think about for a long time afterward. He nodded once. He went to help with Morrow. Harwick came to stand beside Maya. He had the lens cap in his hand. He turned it once between his fingers. Then he held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. He would want you to have it, Harwick said. She took it. She held it in her right palm, the one that had been steady all night, and she felt the letters worn smooth by years of handling. Iron coal. She closed her hand around it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. 5 months later, autumn had come to Portsmouth, Virginia, the way it comes to coastal cities, sideways and persistent, carrying the salt of the harbor in the air, turning the trees along the base perimeter to colors that have no equivalents in Afghanistan or any of the other places the people in this building have been. The elms outside Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, were the color of old copper, and the morning light was the thin, honest light of a season that has decided to stop pretending it is something warmer. Maya Cole stood at the front of a room. She was wearing her dress uniform, which fit her differently than it had in November. She had put back the weight she had lost over 7 months of deployment, and her left shoulder, fully healed, carried itself at the same height as the right again. The mark on her right palm was still visible in certain light, a faint crescent, where the surface temperature of the concrete lintel had met her skin in the seconds before she moved it. She made no effort to conceal it. It was part of the account, and the account was accurate, and she did not see the value in editing accurate accounts. In front of her 16 people, corpsmen and PGs and combat medics on loan from Fort Bragg, young men and women whose average age was 26, selected by a process involving multiple levels of evaluation, sitting in this room because someone with the authority to make these decisions had looked at what had happened in Kos Province in November 2009 and concluded that whatever Maya Cole had done out there needed to be understood, documented, and passed on. The reports had been thorough. The reports had also been inadequate in the way that all accurate reports of things that happen in the field are ultimately inadequate, because reports describe what occurred and cannot fully account for how it felt to stand in it and make the calls that were made. She had not asked for this assignment. She had been asked. She had said yes because of something her grandfather had told her in a Montana field when she was 17 years old, that the work does not end with you unless you let it, and letting it end with you is the only version of this that is actually a failure. He had said it the way he said most things that mattered once, without repetition, trusting that she had heard it. She had heard it. On the table in front of her, she had placed 2 things: a field medical kit, standard corpsman issue, properly stocked, properly organized, the instrument of everything she was certified and trained and credentialed to do. The kit she had carried into Coast Province and out again, repacked 3 times since then, that still had a small dark stain on the interior lining where the blood from Morrow's tourniquet work had reached it in those first 30 seconds. And a single round of 7.62 NATO. Unfired, on its base, scratched with the tip of a knife the word iron. She let the room look at both of them. She gave them time. She had learned from the same man who had given her the round that the temptation to fill silence with explanation is almost always a mistake. The silence does work that explanation cannot. Then she said, "Your hands can do both of these things. If you leave here believing they can only do one, you will be less than you came in as, and the person lying next to you in the field someday will be less likely to get up because of it." She looked at them one by one with full attention and no performance. "We start with the medicine. We always start with the medicine because the medicine always comes first. The person who is bleeding does not care about your other capabilities. They care about the one capability keeping them alive right now. So we start there. We make that part of what you do so certain and so clean and so fast that you could do it asleep. And then when that is done, we talk about the other thing." She picked up the medical kit. "Heal when you can." She set it down. She picked up the round. "Fight when you must." She set it down and looked at the 16 people in front of her. Both hands. In the front row, Finley was writing in a notebook. He was no longer PO3 Finley on his 5th mission, trying not to let anyone see that his hands were uncertain. He was still young. He was still learning. But the way he sat had changed. There was a deliberate quality to his attention that belongs to people who have seen things, that reorganize their sense of what is possible, and who have decided to take that reorganization seriously rather than explain it away. He wrote every word she said. He would keep that notebook for the rest of his career. In the back row, Decker was not writing. He was listening with his full attention, the way he listened in the field, not waiting for what came next, but receiving what was here. He had come to this course as a teaching assistant, not his assigned role and not anyone's requirement, his own decision made quietly in the weeks after Coast, through a process of extended internal accounting that concluded simply and without drama that there was something he owed, and this was the form that paying it took. When the class broke for the first morning session, he would set up the field stations. He would answer the practical questions. He would not explain why he was here to anyone who asked, because the explanation was obvious to anyone paying attention, and the people in this room were being trained to pay attention. Morrow had returned to active duty 6 weeks ago. The femoral wound had healed cleanly. The tourniquet in 31 seconds had made the difference between full recovery and a conversation about what comes after service, his surgeon had told him. He was back with SEAL Team 7, and he had made one modification to his kit, a strip of medical tape on the front panel, written in block letters with a black marker that said what he had decided was the most precise available description of what Maya Cole had done in that compound and what he wanted everyone around him to understand as the standard. Drag them out alive. It had spread the way. True things spread faster than the official channels and with more accuracy than the official language. Finley had it on a card in his notebook. It was on a strip of tape above the door of the training room and at Salerno, where a new cohort of corpsmen were preparing for their first rotation. The VA regional office in Virginia had encountered it in 3 separate after-action reports and had included it without modification in the title of their formal request to Naval Medical Center Portsmouth to develop the integrated combat medicine curriculum for distribution across 4 additional states. 4 words, a description of an intention. The most exact available account of what it meant to bring both things to the field and use them in the order the situation required. Drag them out alive, both hands. That evening, Maya sat on the steps outside her quarters and called her mother. The light was going. The elms were dark shapes against a gray sky, and her breath made small clouds in the cooling air. She was wearing her civilian jacket, an old gray one that had been her grandfather's, that still carried in some fold of the collar the faint smell of Montana in summer that she had stopped trying to explain to people who hadn't been there. The phone rang twice. Her mother's voice, Maya. Mom, a pause. I need to tell you something. I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. Okay, baby. I carried a rifle. She said it with the same flat honesty she used for everything that mattered. I made a promise to you and to Grandpa, and I broke it. I need you to know that I know that, and I need you to know why I did. She told her, not all of it, operational security, lives permanently in the category of things that cannot be fully shared, but the shape of it, the situation, the moment when there was no one else, and the choice between the promise and the person in front of her had resolved itself with a clarity she could not argue with. When she finished, there was a silence on the line long enough that she felt it not as absence, but as the presence of someone taking their time with something real. Then her mother said, "Your father would be proud of you." Maya looked at the copper elms. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." A pause. "And I am proud of you." Her mother's voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person has decided steadiness is what the moment requires. "I was afraid. That is why I asked you to promise. I was so afraid of losing you the way I lost them. But being afraid of losing you was never the same as being right about what you should do with your life." Maya held the phone to her ear and looked at the sky above the elms, which was the gray of harbor water in autumn. Grandpa used to say, she said that the only way to carry something forward is to stay inside the thing that gave it meaning. He did say that. I think I understand what he meant now. The call ended gently without the weight of unresolved things. She sat on the steps with the jacket around her and the harbor cold coming in and the elms fully dark against the sky. In her right hand, she was turning the lens cap slowly between her fingers. Iron coal. She held it until the steps became too cold to sit on, and then she stood and went inside. 3 days later, her phone rang at 6:30. She picked up. The voice on the other end was not her mother's. It was slower, rougher at the edges, shaped by decades of cold mornings in fields where the grass came up to a 10-year-old girl's waist. "Your mother told me," Iron Coal said. Maya sat very still on the edge of her bunk. "She said you might want to talk about it." "I didn't say that." "No." A pause, the kind that belongs to men who have learned to let silence do the work that words cannot. "But you should." Another pause. "You broke your promise." "Yes, sir." The morning light was coming through the window. Outside, the elms were copper. How many people came home because of it? She told him. All of it. The tourniquet in 31 seconds. The first shot that missed. The second that didn't. The lintel. The fire. The moment she had made the decision that there was no one else. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. She could hear his breathing, slow and deliberate, the same rhythm he had taught her to use in a Montana field when she was 10 years old. "Feel the wind before you feel the trigger," he said finally. Not a question, not approval exactly, something more precise than both. "Yes, sir." "You felt it." "Yes, sir." "Then you did what you were trained to do." A long pause. I am not going to tell you I am happy you broke your word to me, Maya. I will tell you I understand why you did. Those are not the same thing. They do not need to be. She looked at the window. Your father would have made the same call, he said quietly, in the same position. I know because I trained him too. She had not known that. She had never known that. She held it. You are coming to Montana this summer. It was not a question. There are things I did not finish teaching you. Time to finish them. The call ended. Maya set the phone down on the bunk beside her. She sat with the morning light coming in through the window, and the weight of what he had said settling into the part of her where things that matter get stored. Both things, not one or the other. Both, the thing he had asked her to set aside and the thing she had been trained to carry, they were not in conflict with each other. They never had been. He had known that when he trained her. He had asked her to promise anyway because of a woman sitting at a kitchen table in Montana who had already lost too much, and that had been right too, and both things being right at the same time was something she was still learning to hold. She picked up her kit and went back to work. There were 16 people waiting to learn something. The morning of the fourth week, Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss arrived at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. His right leg had healed cleanly. He was walking without compensation. He came to the building where the course was running, asked for Corpsman Cole at the front desk in a way that was not how it was done, but was how he did it, and Maya came down the corridor, and they stood in the entrance for a moment before he said anything. He had a folder in his hand. I have a briefing at 800 tomorrow, he said. New assignment, different theater, different configuration. There is a position on the team that has not been filled. He held out the folder. She took it and opened it. The position was titled Combat Integrator. The description below the title ran to half a page, and she read all of it, and as she read it, she understood that someone had taken time to write down in the formal language of military documentation the thing she had spent 11 days and one very long night in Afghanistan trying to demonstrate, not by explaining it, not by arguing for it, but by doing it until the doing was the argument. She looked up. Voss was watching her with the pale gray eyes that had been watching her since she walked into a briefing room in San Diego and opened a mission folder before anyone else had reached for theirs. If you are ready, he said. She looked at the folder. She looked at the corridor behind her, at the classroom where 16 people were learning to use both hands at the building that had taken the shape of the things she had decided to carry forward. She looked at Voss. Steady hand, sir. She closed the folder. I am always ready. In the front row of the classroom, Finley was writing in a notebook. He was no longer PO3. Finley on his fifth mission, trying not to let anyone see that his hands were unsteady. He was still young, still learning, but the way he sat had changed the deliberate attention of a person who has seen things that reorganized his sense of what is possible and who has decided to take that reorganization seriously. He wrote every word. In the back row, Decker was not writing, he was listening. He had come to this course as a teaching assistant, not his assigned role, not anyone's requirement, entirely his own decision made quietly and implemented without announcement. When the class broke for the first morning session, he was the one setting up the field stations. He was the one answering the practical questions. He was not doing it because he had been asked. He was doing it because there are ways of saying something that do not use words, and this was one of them, and it was the most honest thing he knew how to do. 3 weeks after the first class completed, the VA regional office in Virginia submitted a formal request to Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, to develop the integrated combat medicine curriculum for distribution across 3 additional states. The request cited outcome data from previous deployments and used in its formal language, a phrase that had been moving through the community since November 1st in the reports, then in the quarters, then in the informal network by which true things travel faster than the official channels designed to carry them. Morrow had it written on a patch he wore on his kit in block letters on medical tape. Finley had it on a card tucked into the front cover of his notebook. It had appeared on the door of the training room at Salerno, where a new cohort of corpsmen were preparing for their first rotation. 4 words, not a slogan, not a motto, a description of an intention, the most precise available description of what Maya Cole had done in Coast Province in November 2009 and what she was now teaching the next generation to do. Drag them out alive. She was never just a medic. She had never been just a medic. The people who called her that had been working from incomplete information, and in fairness to them, she had provided them with incomplete information because she had made a promise and she had intended to keep it, and the form that keeping it took was not explaining what else she was. She had come in with a kit and a set of credentials and a name tape that said Cole, and she had let those things speak for her, and they had said doc. They had said support. They had said she will be fine as long as nobody needs more from her than what she's supposed to provide. They had not said she has been training in a Montana field since she was 10 years old, And the man who trained her is the best this institution has ever produced. And she is here because she believes in the work and she promised to do it with both hands. And she intends to keep that promise, even when keeping it is hard, and break it when breaking it is right. She was a medic. She was also everything else she had ever been trained to be. And the integration of those two things, the understanding that they were not in opposition, that they never had been, that the same steadiness that made you good with a tourniquet made you good with a trigger, and the same patience that made you good with a trigger made you good with a tourniquet. That integration was what she had come to teach. Both hands. Always both hands. Iron Cole was 63 years old when he had trained his granddaughter to read the wind in a Montana field. He was 71 when she called him from the steps of her quarters in Portsmouth and told him what she had done with what he had given her. He was in that field when she called bad hip cold, mourning the dry grass not as high as it used to be, the rifle leaning against the fence post the way it had leaned for 40 years. He listened to everything she said. He did not tell her he was proud until she had finished, and not because he was not proud. He had been proud of her since she was 10 years old and had stood in this field and asked him what to do when there was no wind. And he had told her there was always wind, and she had looked at the field and the sky in the morning for a long time, and then she had said, "I can feel it." And she had been right. She had been right since the first morning, and she had been right in that compound in the dark with a rifle that was not hers, and a wind that had shifted, and a choice that had no version of itself that did not cost something. He said what he said about her father because it was true, and because she deserved to know it was true, and because he had carried it long enough. He stood in the Montana field after the call and looked at the sky for a while. Then he picked up the rifle. The field was cold. The grass was dry. The wind was moving from the northwest at about 12 knots with a slight variation in the upper layer. He read it the way he had always read it, with his hands and his eyes and the parts of him that had learned to pay attention to things that other people walked right past. He thought about a girl who was now a woman who was standing in a classroom in Portsmouth teaching people to use both hands, who had walked into a burning building and come out with someone who needed to come out, who had felt the wind and waited and done what she was trained to do. Both hands. He smiled at the field. Then he raised the rifle, settled his breathing, and looked through the scope at a distance he had been shooting since before she was born. The wind held steady. He squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. The shot broke clean. He lowered the rifle, looked at the sky, and said something quietly to no one in particular, to the field maybe, or to the memory of a man who had once stood in this field with him and learned the same lessons in the same cold air. Something short, the kind of thing that does not need to be heard by anyone else to mean what it means. Then he turned and walked back toward the house through the dry grass in the thin Montana morning, carrying everything he had always carried and something new alongside it, the knowledge that he had taught the right things to the right person and that the right person had known what to do with them when the moment came. That is all any teacher can ask for. That is more than most ever get. The field was quiet after he was gone. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves from the northwest, the way it had been moving through that field for longer than anyone in this story had been alive, and the way it would keep moving long after the last of them was gone, patient, indifferent, and always, always there for anyone who learned to feel it.